And today is Franklin Roosevelt's birthday. The original modern-era liberal. Actually, you could say Teddy Roosevelt, the Republican president of the beginning of the 19th century, was the archetype, I suppose, of the modern liberal. He proudly called himself that. And William Howard Taft, the Republican who followed him, who broke up Standard Oil, was a liberal. That was back in the days when the Republican Party had a large liberal contingent. 1907, they passed the Tillman Act that made it a felony for a corporation to give money to candidates for political office, for example. But Franklin Roosevelt brought us the 40-hour work week, brought us unionization, brought us Social Security. It was the New Deal style liberal economics that brought us Medicaid and Medicare and the minimum wage. Well, FDR brought us the minimum wage. A whole variety of programs that created, I would say, created the modern American middle class and kept people, when they fell out of the middle class, from falling too hard and hitting the ground too hard. Jack Kennedy famously said he was proud to be called a liberal. This is from the JFK Library. Here he is.
But if by a liberal they mean someone who looks ahead and not behind, someone who welcomes new ideas without rigid reactions, someone who cares about the welfare of the people, their health, their housing, their schools, their jobs, their civil rights and their civil liberties, someone who believes that we can break through the stalemate and suspicions that grip us in our policies abroad. If that is what they mean by a liberal, then I'm proud to say that I'm a liberal.
That was Jack Kennedy speaking before the Liberal Party of New York State. On the line with us is Fred Siegel, senior fellow with the Manhattan Institute, contributing editor to the City Journal, author of The Revolt Against the Masses, How Liberalism Has Undermined the Middle Class. Fred, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Are you using the word liberalism in the classic European sense, what we call conservatives here, or are you really asserting that all the things that I just laid out have actually worked against the middle class?
Neither. The reform movements from 1900 to 1920, roughly 1920, were part of the progressive era. Progressivism was bipartisan. You had Teddy Roosevelt among the Republicans. You had Woodrow Wilson among the Democrats. The traditional account on both liberals and conservatives is the history of liberalism begins with progressivism. It proceeds to the New Deal and on to the Great Society. I argue that that's wrong. That liberalism, as we understand it, was first used. The term was first used, and the concept, as we understand it today, was first used in the early 1920s to mean something quite different. The logic of progressivism to the New Deal to the Great Society is true if you're talking about the growth of the administrative state. There is a continuity. But progressives, Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, were intensely moralistic Protestants. They believed in social uplift. The New Deal broke with all that. The height of progressivism was prohibition. That wasn't passed by right-wing yahoos. That was passed by progressives who wanted to make sure when a guy came home on Friday, he hadn't drunk away his paycheck.
Well, actually, it was. I think that I've read at least one book on the history of that era, and one of the problems that we had in the 1920s was that, particularly during the Roaring Twenties, after what's his name? Harding was elected in 1921, and he dropped the top income tax rate down to 25%. Was that so much money was going up to the top, but the working classes were just being crushed, and the morning, what we call a coffee break, started becoming the booze break, and people were sloshed by the time they got home from work.
With all due respect, you didn't read widely enough. Alcoholism, the problem of the saloon was a perpetual problem of American society from the Civil War to World War I.
Yeah, I don't disagree. But it was.
The prohibition was passed in 1919, before Harding. Okay. Harding was elected in 1920. No, this was.
But my point is that the factories of that era, these were people who were working 8, 9, 10, 12-hour days sometimes.
Often 12 hours. They were often 12-hour shifts.
Right.
They worked brutal days, and they
drank during their breaks.
It wasn't just drinking during the breaks. It was drinking during the day,
continuously.
Workplace accidents. It was
yeah. So you know, we tried the wrong solution. I mean, we thought that the problem was alcoholism. The problem was that people were being worked to death, and they were using alcohol as a salve.
I would agree with that.
Okay.
I think your description is accurate.
But how is it that you can say liberalism has undermined the middle class? I mean, with that single exception, which I think was a misguided attempt to solve a real problem.
Tom, let me explain it. The first people who called themselves liberals in the wake of World War I were people immensely angry with Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson had been a progressive hero, not a liberal. There was no liberals yet, but progressive hero in 1917 when he was opposed to the war. When he went into the war, he did something at home which stunned people. He unleashed tremendous repression.
You're talking about the Alien Sedition Act.
Far beyond that, the American Protective League attacks on German Americans. It was an ugly stretch.
Right.
At the end of the war, there was disillusion not only with the peace in Europe, but with the effects of the war.
Well, you can call that liberal, but I would call that reactionary. I would call that conservative.
When you want to let me explain this, I'll be glad to.
Well, yeah, I've been letting you have
I
paragraphs.
haven't gotten to the point yet.
Okay, well, get to the point, please. We have 3 minutes left.
I'd be glad to. The point is that you had a whole number of people in the wake of the war who decried the middle class and blamed the middle class for the war. Sinclair Lewis, Main Street, Babbitt. It can't happen here. These were the first people who called themselves liberals, and they adopted European attitudes toward the middle class. European hostility toward the private sector and middle class was de rigueur on both left and right. What the liberals of the 1920s wanted was a more hierarchical, more aristocratic, more European society. That liberalism.
I didn't get that from It Can't Happen Here.
Sorry?
I haven't read the other two books that you described, but I have read It Can't Happen Here, and I didn't see that in there.
Who are the bad guys in Canada? Where does fascism come from?
It's been at least 50. Well, it comes from the people.
Well, no, it comes from the Rotary clubs.
Yeah.
It's the book opens in a Rotary club, and it goes on. The idea that the people, the middle class themselves, are the source of fascism is something.
So you're defining the middle class as the small business person,
not just the small business person,
as opposed to the working class.
The private sector, middle class, more broadly. Main Street.
So how is it that today people who call themselves liberals, who are following the traditions of Franklin Roosevelt and Lyndon Johnson, how can you say that they're destroying the middle class when it is the Republicans and the conservatives who want to cut the...
The new left pushed them aside. The new left was immensely hostile to the social democratic politics of the New Deal. That social democratic politics of the New Deal lasted from about 1935 to about 1965. The new left had no use for that. McGovern had no use for the kind of trade unionism you're talking about, the kind of social solidarity you're talking about.
McGovern was a total advocate of trade unions.
I don't know what 60s you're talking about.
I lived through them.
Ditto. And the 60s I lived through, the idea of making fun of the guy who took his boat down to the shore on the weekends was de rigueur. The whole point was to transcend conventional middle-class norms, not to allow people to move into them.
No, the whole point, I was a member of SDS in the 1960s.
Ditto.
I mean, the whole point was to bring people up into the middle class. I mean, the Port Huron document that Tom Hayden wrote was about social justice.
1961. Tell me what happened by 1965, 1966.
We're out of time, and I don't know the answer to your question. Interesting conversation, Fred. We're going to have a longer version of it someday. Fred Siegel, Senior Fellow of the Manhattan Institute. We'll be back.